March 21, 1987. The king of cool is about to learn that the rules of coolness don't apply when it comes to a father's love for his son. Nothing in the world of entertainment can prepare you for what's about to happen. On this day, the greatest entertainer of the 20th century would begin his descent into a grief so profound, so devastating, that it would ultimately claim his life 8 years later on Christmas morning. We need to understand who Dean Paul Martin Jr. really was. Not just another Nepo baby trying to make it in the industry. Dino Jr., as everyone called him, was something entirely different. He was his father's pride and joy, but more importantly, he was a genuinely talented human being who desperately wanted to prove that the Martin name didn't need show business tricks to shine. It shined because of genuine ability. Dean Paul Martin Jr. was born on November 17, 1951. From the moment he took his first breath, he was surrounded by Hollywood royalty. His godparents? Frank Sinatra. His babysitters? Some of the biggest names in entertainment. When Dean Paul was just a toddler, Marilyn Monroe herself would watch over him in his nursery. Can you imagine? The most beautiful and famous woman in the world rocking an infant to sleep. But here's the thing, Dino Jr. didn't need all that celebrity shine to make his own mark. He had his own light, his own brilliance. When Dino Jr. was just 13 years old, he formed a pop band with Desi Arnaz Jr. and a kid named Billy Hinshaw. This wasn't some father-arranged vanity project. This was genuine teenage talent. The trio, called Dino, Desi, and Billy, actually got their start when Frank Sinatra himself heard them rehearsing in Dean Martin's home. Sinatra was so impressed that he personally brought them into his Reprise record studio and got them a recording contract. And here's what's remarkable. They actually had hits, real hits. Their song, I'm a Fool, climbed to number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100. Not the Lovin' Kind made it to number 25. These weren't charitable placements on the charts. These were legitimate chart successes that proved Dino Jr. had genuine talent flowing through his veins. He performed on The Ed Sullivan Show. He toured as an opening act for the Beach Boys. He was a legitimate rock and roll star before he turned 15. But Dino Jr. didn't stop there. It was almost like he couldn't help himself from excelling at everything he touched. He became a professional tennis player, a world-ranked player who competed in Wimbledon qualifiers. He pursued acting, landing a Golden Globe nomination for his role in the film Players, opposite Ali MacGraw. Then came his starring role in the NBC television series Misfits of Science, where he played the lead character Dr. Billy Hayes, alongside an unknown actress named Courtney Cox. He was a race car driver. He was a semi-professional football player. He wanted to try everything, to experience everything. He had an insatiable hunger for life and for proving himself on his own merits. And then, seeking perhaps the ultimate test of manhood, the ultimate challenge to his own abilities and independence, he joined the United States Air Force. This wasn't a decision made lightly. This was a conscious choice to push himself beyond the boundaries of entertainment, to prove something deeper about who he was as a person. On November 5, 1980, Dean Paul Martin Jr. reported to Officer Candidate School at McGee-Tyson Air Force Base in Knoxville, Tennessee. He wanted to be more than an entertainer. He wanted to be more than Dean Martin's son. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to earn his stripes and prove that the Martin name represented honor, sacrifice, and duty to something greater than oneself. He trained as a pilot in the Cessna T-37 Tweet and the Northrop T-38 Talon at Columbus Air Force Base. Then he went on to train as a fighter pilot in the McDonnell F-4 Phantom II at Luke Air Force Base. In November of 1981, he completed his training and was assigned to the 196th Tactical Fighter Squadron of the 163rd Tactical Fighter Group, the California Air National Guard based at March Air Force Base in Riverside County. His sister Dina recalls him telling her something that would echo through the years. He told her that he joined the Air Force to make something of himself, to make a meaningful contribution. He wanted to prove that he was more than just an entertainer's son. He was about duty, honor, and service to his country. Dean Martin Sr. was incredibly proud of his son. In an interview he said about Dino Jr. joining the Air Force, "I'm proud of him. I'd be proud even if he didn't become a jet pilot, because he's a good boy. He just doesn't know what he wants to be." But the truth was, Dean Martin Sr. knew exactly what his son was becoming. He was becoming a man. A real man, an independent man, a man who would prove to the world that the Martin name represented excellence in every single endeavor he undertook. Dean Paul had also married an Olympic gold medal figure skater named Dorothy Hamill on January 8, 1982. The wedding was held in a Beverly Hills church with 350 guests in attendance. Desi Arnaz Jr. was there. Dean Martin himself was there to celebrate his son's union. This was a man who had found love, who had committed himself to building a life with someone equally accomplished and extraordinary. By 1987, Captain Dean Paul Martin Jr. had become a fighter pilot for the California Air National Guard. He was 35 years old. He had lived more life, accomplished more things, and proven himself in more ways than most people do in a lifetime. He had worn multiple hats: entertainer, athlete, actor, race driver, husband, and warrior. But he was also still that boy who loved his father. He was still that son who wanted to make his dad proud every single day of his life. Now, March 21st, 1987 was supposed to be a routine day, a routine training exercise. Captain Dean Paul Martin Jr. was assigned to fly what the Air Force calls a tactical leadership course. It was a training mission to help pilots sharpen their skills, to keep them combat ready, to prepare them for anything that might come their way in the real world. 3 F-4 Phantom jets took off from March Air Force Base that morning. Captain Dean Paul Martin Jr. was piloting the number 2 aircraft in the formation. His call sign that day was Grizzly 72. In the rear seat, as his weapons system officer, was Captain Ramon Ortiz, a 39-year-old from Las Vegas. The weather briefing that morning warned them about conditions. There were airmets issued, aviation warnings about mountain obscuration, moderate turbulence, and moderate to heavy icing above the freezing level. The winds aloft were forecast to be coming from the southwest at approximately 40 to 50 knots. These were challenging conditions, but nothing that would be considered impossible for a trained fighter pilot. The 3 Phantoms took off from March AFB and began a maximum performance climb through multiple layers of clouds. As they climbed higher and higher, visibility became nearly impossible. Snow began falling, heavy snow. The weather was deteriorating faster than the forecasts had predicted. Formation flying became impossible, so the pilots switched to radar contact, maintaining their positions relative to each other through their instruments rather than their eyes. There were at least 3 altitude changes and multiple direction changes ordered by Ontario International Airport Air Traffic Control. Controllers were desperately trying to keep these aircraft away from the mountainous terrain. The San Bernardino Mountains are absolutely treacherous, peaks rising over 11,000 feet, creating wind shear, downdrafts, and turbulence that can catch experienced pilots completely off guard. Grizzly 72 were picking up a potential conflict with San Gorgonio Mountain, one controller called out, urgently trying to alert Dean Paul to the danger. The instructions were clear. Change your heading, avoid the mountain, get to a higher altitude. But Dino Jr. never made that turn. He never altered his heading in time. As Dean Paul and Ramon Ortiz climbed higher and higher, pushing their F-4 Phantom to maximum performance, Dean Paul was flying on instruments in a complete whiteout. The snow was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. According to the investigation report, what likely happened was that Dean Paul lost his spatial orientation. This happens to even the most experienced pilots. When you're climbing steeply while accelerating, punching through multiple cloud layers, passing in and out of visibility windows, your inner ear can become confused. You lose your sense of which way is up. Your instruments become your only reality. But if there's even a millisecond of hesitation, even a moment of doubt, that can be fatal. The pilot of the number 3 aircraft, Grizzly 73, briefly caught a glimpse of Dean Paul's Phantom through a break in the clouds. What he saw made his heart freeze. The Phantom was in a sharp left roll, its afterburners ignited, and then it disappeared back into the clouds. The radar contact was lost at 10:29 in the morning. The last recorded position put them at about 10,000 feet altitude, descending rapidly, heading directly toward Mount San Gorgonio. The investigators would later calculate that the aircraft plummeted approximately 4,000 feet from its last radar altitude reading. The McDonnell F-4C Phantom II, serial number 64923, slammed into the side of Mount San Gorgonio at approximately 560 miles per hour. There was no explosion immediately visible. The aircraft hit in a remote mountainous area. The mountains absorbed the impact. The emergency locator transmitter began its piercing rhythmic beacon, that electronic cry for help that went unanswered for hours. Concerned family members called in the report that the aircraft was overdue. Search and rescue was activated. But the weather conditions in the San Bernardino Mountains were absolutely terrible. Snowstorms raged. Visibility was near zero. The rescue teams couldn't immediately reach the crash site. It would take 6 days of intensive searching through snow and treacherous mountain terrain before rescue workers finally located the wreckage. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, at Bally's Casino, Dean Martin was performing one of his legendary evening shows. The main showroom was packed with 5,000 people, all of them there to see the King of Cool perform. They were there to hear his silky voice croon through classics like Ain't That a Kick in the Head and That's Amore. They were there to experience the legend, the man who defined cool for an entire generation. Dean Martin took the stage around 9:35 p.m. that evening. The audience erupted. This was what they came for. This was the moment they wanted. Dean Martin began to sing Everybody Loves Somebody. His voice was smooth as ever, carrying the audience away to another time, another place. The orchestra behind him swelled. The audience was completely mesmerized. But then, something extraordinary happened. Something that no one in that audience expected. Something that would be talked about in Hollywood for decades to come. In the middle of the verse, right there, mid-performance, mid-song, Dean Martin stopped singing. He just stopped. His voice trailed away. He looked toward the wings of the stage where his manager stood. His manager was holding a telephone. There was an expression on his manager's face that told Dean everything he needed to know before any words could be spoken. Dean Martin's face went pale. The microphone hung in his hand. The orchestra kept playing for a few moments, not realizing what was happening. The audience kept watching, thinking perhaps this was some new bit, some piece of theater that the legendary performer was adding to the show. But Dean Martin simply dropped the microphone. He turned and walked off the stage. No announcement, no explanation. He just walked away. The audience sat in stunned silence. Was it part of the show? Was it some elaborate theatrical moment? It took several minutes for them to understand that something real, something terrible had just happened. "Your son's plane has gone missing," someone said to Dean Martin. Words that would shatter his world forever. Captain Dean Paul Martin's F-4 Phantom went down in the San Bernardino Mountains this morning during a training exercise. Search and rescue teams have been searching all day, but they haven't been able to locate the wreckage yet due to the weather conditions. In that moment, Dean Martin wasn't the cool entertainer anymore. He wasn't the Rat Pack icon anymore. He wasn't the man who had conquered Hollywood and made the whole world love him. In that moment, he was just a father whose son, his pride, his joy, his immortality, was possibly lost in those cold mountains. The next 6 days were agonizing. 6 days of waiting, 6 days of hope mixed with dread. 6 days of prayers and phone calls and desperate conversations with military officials. 6 days of trying to hold on to the possibility that somehow, miraculously, Dean Paul had survived, that he had managed to eject from the aircraft, that he was somewhere in those mountains waiting to be found. Then, on March 27th, search and rescue teams finally located the wreckage. What they found ended all hope. The confirmation came. Captain Dean Paul Martin Jr. and Captain Ramon Ortiz had perished instantly at the time of impact. The aircraft was completely destroyed. There was no survival. There was no miraculous rescue. There was only death. Dean Martin's world stopped spinning at that moment. When the confirmation came, when he finally understood that his golden boy was gone forever, he didn't scream, he didn't rage against the heavens, he didn't throw things or demand answers. According to witnesses who were with him at that time, Dean Martin simply collapsed inward, as if the very strings that held his body together had suddenly been cut. It was as if a light went out inside him, a light that would never shine as brightly again. The funeral was held in late March, just days after the bodies had been recovered from Mount San Gorgonio. It was a somber affair, filled with Hollywood personalities, military officials, and family members. But for Dean Martin, the funeral was something else entirely. It was the moment where he had to say goodbye to the one person who had made him complete. The one person who represented his legacy. The one person who would carry the Martin name forward into the future. In the days and weeks that followed, friends and family noticed something had changed in Dean Martin. Rich Little, who was very close to Dean, would later say that from that moment forward, Dean Martin was never the same. Once he lost his son, that was the end of him, Rich would recall, his voice filled with emotion and sadness. That was a big part of him that died and never recovered. Dean Martin's daughter, Deanna, would stand at his own funeral 8 years later and make a statement that would capture the true tragedy of this story. She said simply, "My father never recovered from losing Dino." Author William Keck, who was a reporter for the National Enquirer and who had befriended Dean Martin over the years, described what he witnessed in Dean's final years. "It was like looking at a candle without a flame," Keck said about Dean Martin in those final years. Dean Martin's final years were very, very sad after he lost his son. The joy, the sparkle, the coolness, it all just disappeared. The King of Cool retreated to his fortress on Mountain Drive. He shut the gates. He closed himself off from the world. While people outside celebrated holidays and birthdays and life milestones, Dean Martin sat in silence. The man who had spent his entire life as an entertainer, who had thrived on applause and laughter and connection with audiences, now sat alone. He sat in rooms where his son's presence was painfully absent. Those close to him noticed something heartbreaking. Dean Martin would sometimes go to restaurants, nice restaurants, where he could once command the room with his mere presence, but he would sit alone at a table and request something strange. He would ask for the staff to bring him 2 plates of food. He would eat from one plate, and the other would sit empty beside him. And when family members asked him why, he would say, "Well, Dino should be here. Dino should be sitting here with me." He wanted the chair beside him to feel less empty. He wanted to maintain the connection, the spiritual presence of his son, even if it was just through an empty plate of food placed in front of an empty chair. That's what grief reduced the King of Cool to, a man dining with ghosts. In December of 1987, 9 months after his son's death, Frank Sinatra came knocking. Not literally, of course, but through the channels of Hollywood, through the persistent voice of a man who had been Dean's brother in every way except blood. Sinatra had an idea. A tour, a reunion tour. The 3 musketeers of the entertainment world, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr., would reunite after more than 2 decades of sporadic appearances together. They would call it Together Again. The press conference was held at Chasen's Restaurant in Beverly Hills on December 2nd, 1987. Frank, Dean, and Sammy sat together in their tuxedos, elegant as ever, presenting the image of men ready to conquer the world one more time. The announcement electrified the entertainment world. Tickets sold out immediately. 29 concerts were scheduled across major venues in America. The media was breathless with anticipation. This was going to be the event of the decade. But behind the scenes, in private conversations, a different story was being told. Frank Sinatra was genuinely concerned about Dean. He was worried that his brother was dying, that grief was consuming him, that isolation was eating him alive. Sinatra genuinely believed that getting Dean back on stage, surrounding him with his friends, would be therapeutic. Sinatra told associates, "I think it would be great for Dean. Get him out. For that alone, it would be worth doing." Dean Martin, however, accepted the proposal with what observers described as indifference. He went through the motions. He showed up to rehearsals. He participated in the press conference. But those who knew him best could see it in his eyes. The light was gone. The thing that had made Dean Martin the king of cool, the thing that had made him shine brighter than a Vegas neon sign, had been extinguished on the side of a mountain in San Bernardino. The rehearsals were revealing. Frank Sinatra came prepared. His voice was still magnificent. His command of the stage was still absolute. Sammy Davis Jr. was vibrant, energetic, ready to recapture the old magic. But Dean was struggling. He was overwhelmed by the sheer size of the venues. The Oakland Coliseum could hold 14,500 people. The Chicago Theater had massive stages. These weren't the intimate Las Vegas lounges where Dean had spent most of his performing career in recent years. These were cavernous spaces that demanded a performer to project, to connect with audiences far away, to fill the air with energy and presence. And Dean simply didn't have it to give. On March 13, 1988, exactly 11 days short of 1 year after his son's death, Dean Martin walked on the stage of the Oakland Coliseum Arena to face a sold-out crowd of 14,500 people. The audience erupted. This was what they came for. This was the moment, the reunion they had dreamed about. The King of Cool, along with Sinatra and Davis, the holy trinity of American entertainment, back together at last. Sammy Davis Jr. opened the show. His voice was strong. His delivery was energetic and alive. The audience loved him. Then came Dean Martin. He sang his songs, he did his bits, he tried to find that old magic, that old smoothness that had defined him. But something was fundamentally different. It was as if he was performing in a language he no longer spoke fluently. The words came out, but the soul had been stripped from them. The key moment came during the performance. It was part of his comedy act, something that Dean had done thousands of times over the decades. He took a lit cigarette. He was a lifelong smoker, had been chain smoking since he was 16 years old, and he threw it into the audience as a humorous gesture. It was meant to get laughs. It was meant to be the kind of irreverent, cool gesture that only Dean Martin could pull off. But this time, something went wrong. This time, the gesture landed wrong with Frank Sinatra. After the show ended, Sinatra pulled Dean aside backstage. There was anger in Frank's voice. Frank reproached him for the stunt. The two friends, brothers, really, had words. This wasn't a typical disagreement between colleagues. This was a rupture between two men who had built their entire careers and friendship on trust and mutual respect. From that moment forward, the atmosphere of the tour shifted. It became strained. It became tense. The camaraderie that had defined the Rat Pack for decades was fractured. Dean wasn't at the level of his colleagues. Everyone knew it. Frank and Sammy knew it. The promoters knew it. The audience knew it. The magic that they were supposed to recreate simply wasn't there. A few days later, during the Chicago theater performances, Dean Martin announced that he was withdrawing from the tour. The official reason given was that he was having a flare-up of a kidney infection. But anyone who had been paying attention knew the real reason. Dean simply couldn't do it. His heart wasn't in it. His soul wasn't in it. He was running on empty, and even the presence of his dearest friends couldn't fill the void. Dean went back to Los Angeles, back to his home, back to the silence and the solitude. Sinatra and Davis were devastated. Sinatra was initially reluctant to continue the tour without Dean. He felt it would be disrespectful to the audiences, who had paid good money to see all three of them. But the financial reality was undeniable. The tour was sold out. Sponsors were expecting a tour. The media was watching. So, a solution was found. Liza Minnelli, the brilliant performer and daughter of Judy Garland, was brought in to replace Dean Martin. The tour was renamed The Ultimate Event and continued on, and by most accounts it became one of the most successful concert tours of 1988 and 1989. Frank and Sammy could still draw crowds. Liza brought her own brilliance to the proceedings. The show went on. But for Dean Martin, the show was over. He didn't know it yet, but he had just given his last performance as an entertainer. In December of 1988, nearly 2 years after his son's death, Dean Martin officially retired from performing. He was asked by a reporter why he had decided to step away, why he was leaving the stage that had defined his life for so many decades. His answer was simple, and it carried within it all the weight of his shattered world. He said, "What's the point?" Those 3 words, "What's the point?" tell you everything you need to know about what had happened to the King of Cool. Here was a man who had dominated the entertainment industry for 4 decades, a man whose voice had sold millions of records, a man who had made people laugh, made people cry, made people feel alive through his performances. And now he was asking himself the fundamental question, what is the point of any of it? The years that followed were a slow descent into a kind of living death. Dean Martin retired to what friends describe as a routine of profound isolation and melancholy. He frequented a restaurant called La Familia, a nice Italian place in Beverly Hills. Nearly every night he would go there and sit alone. He had a uniform of sorts that he wore every single day, navy pants and a light blue shirt. He would order the same thing every night, Clams Casino, and he would sit there, letting the clam juice drip down his shirt, not caring, not bothering to wipe it away. What was particularly heartbreaking was what people observed happening at nearby tables. Dean's ex-wife, Jeannie Bigger, from one of his earlier marriages, would often be dining at the same restaurant, and they would sit separately, with a distance between them, 2 people connected by history, but separated by the unbridgeable gulf of grief and time. A reporter who observed this scene would later describe it as being like watching a wax figure that was barely moving around. The vitality had left his body, only the shell remained. Sometimes his daughter Dino would join him for dinner. There was a gentleness between them, a mutual understanding that didn't require words. On those nights, Dino would call and say, "Dad, would you like us to come have dinner with you tonight?" And Dean would respond, "Well, sure, just no chit-chat." "I don't mind the chit. It's the chat." He wanted companionship, but he wanted it to be quiet. He wanted to be around people he loved, but he didn't want to have to engage in the performance of normalcy. He didn't want to pretend to be okay. Dina would later reflect on those dinners and what they meant. She said about her father, he didn't want to have a lot of people around him. He was perfectly happy being alone at a restaurant. He was secure with who he was, but there was a sadness there. She understood on some deep level that her father had not just lost a son, he had lost the will to live. He had lost the fire that had animated his entire existence. A man named William Keck, who had befriended Dean Martin in later years and who worked as a reporter and author, witnessed this transformation firsthand. Keck was struck by the contrast between the Dean Martin he had known and this new version, this diminished version. He would sit with Dean at La Familia and later write about the experience. He described it as like looking at a candle without a flame. The wick is still there, the wax is still there, but the light. Keck recalled warm greetings from Dean. Dean still had his manners, his courtesy. He would always say hello when Keck approached his table. He would ask how things were going. And then Keck would hear Dean say something that broke his heart. "I'll be back on that stage one day. You'll see me. I'm telling you, I'll be back." But even as he said the words, there was no conviction behind them. Both men knew he was lying. Both men understood that the stage was forever closed to Dean Martin. Another friend, Paul Anka, who had worked with Dean in the past, gave an interview about what happened. Anka said that Dean Paul's death was a huge turning point in Dean's life. It wasn't just sad. It wasn't just grief. It was a fundamental shift in who Dean Martin was as a person. The accident had rewritten the entire narrative of his existence. Rich Little, a comedian and impressionist who was close to Dean Martin, gave perhaps the most eloquent assessment of what had occurred. Rich said, with emotion in his voice, once he lost his son, that was the end of him. That was a big part of him that died and never recovered. It was as if Dean Martin's death had occurred in 2 stages. First, spiritually, on March 21, 1987, when his son's plane hit the mountain, and then physically, years later, when his body finally gave up. During these years of isolation and withdrawal, Dean Martin was not in good health. He had always been a heavy smoker. He started chain smoking as a teenager and had continued the habit for over 60 years. By his 60s, he was showing signs of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the progressive lung disease that is the inevitable result of a lifetime of smoking. The cough that had once been just an occasional thing became persistent and severe. Beyond the smoking, Dean had other health issues related to his long-time heavy drinking, though it's worth noting that many believe Dean's public persona of being drunk was often an act. that the drink in his hand was frequently just apple juice. But in these final years after his son's death, that act became reality. He drank heavily for real. He also became dependent on prescription medication. His body was breaking down, ravaged by decades of hard living, and now compounded by the emotional trauma of an unbearable loss. Then, on September 16, 1993, Dean Martin received a diagnosis that no one, not even his depleted state, could ignore. At Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, doctors discovered that his lungs, which had been damaged by 60 years of smoking, had developed cancer. Tumors filled his lungs. The doctors told him the truth. They predicted that he had only months to live. Without treatment, without intervention, his time was running out. Faced with this reality, Dean Martin made a decision that shocked everyone around him. The doctors told him that there was a way forward. They could perform surgery, major surgery on his liver and kidneys, the kinds of operations that could potentially extend his life significantly, that could potentially give him more time. And Dean said no. He refused the surgery. He refused the treatment. He refused the intervention that could have kept him alive. Some people saw this as a form of passive suicide, an acceptance of death, a deliberate choice not to fight anymore. Perhaps they were right, or perhaps Dean simply understood something that others didn't, that he had already lost the reason to keep living. His golden boy was gone, the music had stopped. What would more years mean if they were going to be years of loneliness, years of sitting in restaurants alone, years of pretending to want to go on? Still, even in the face of his diagnosis, even in the knowledge that cancer was consuming his body, Dean managed one more moment of the old magic. On June 7, 1994, his 77th birthday, he appeared at a birthday celebration. He performed briefly. Those who were there said that he did so rather jauntily, that there was a moment where the old Dean Martin flickered back to life, just for a moment, just for a few minutes. But it was brief, like a match struck in the darkness before being extinguished by the wind. As for the smoking, he finally quit at age 76 in 1993, after more than 60 years of the habit. It was, of course, too late. The damage was done. The cancer was already entrenched. The lungs that had sung his beautiful voice were now filled with tumors. But at least he tried. At least in those final years, he made the decision to finally put out the cigarette for good. By early 1995, Dean Martin had essentially disappeared from public life entirely. He stopped leaving his home. He stopped performing. He stopped going to restaurants. He became completely and utterly withdrawn, a prisoner in his own home. When people he knew called to check on him, the responses became more and more sparse, more and more distant. The world was calling for Dean Martin, and Dean Martin was no longer answering during this period. His friend William Keck would later write that what he witnessed was heartbreaking in its totality. I remember him always greeting me with that warm smile. It was heartbreaking. I don't think his broken heart ever healed. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1995, Dean Martin spent his last evening on Earth. There are conflicting accounts of who was with him. Some say he was alone with a hired nurse or caregiver, sitting in his Beverly Hills home watching television, sipping red wine. Others say his ex-wife Jeannie was with him that night, that she remained by his side as his health rapidly deteriorated. Either way, the end was approaching. On that Christmas Eve night or in the early morning hours of Christmas Day, Dean Martin's body began to shut down. The emphysema that had been ravaging his lungs for years, compounded by the cancer that had invaded his chest, finally became overwhelming. His body could no longer process oxygen. His heart, weakened by decades of alcohol abuse, began to fail. The coughing became severe, uncontrollable, and then, at approximately 3:30 in the morning on December 25, 1995, Dean Martin took his last breath. The medical examiner would later list acute respiratory failure as the cause of death, emphysema as the primary factor, heart failure as a contributing factor, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the accumulation of a lifetime of smoking, drinking, and finally, the unbearable weight of grief. He died on Christmas Day, the day when families come together, the day when joy is supposed to fill the air, the day when the world celebrates hope and renewal. And Dean Martin died alone, in his home in Beverly Hills, leaving behind a world that would mourn him, but none more than the parts of himself that had died 8 years earlier on the side of a mountain. His family released a statement saying they were devastated. They kept the details quiet. They wanted privacy in their mourning. Bill Pierce, a manager at Pierce Brothers Mortuary, which was handling the arrangements, told the media they're trying to keep it quiet at this time. The family would release details and funeral arrangements the following day. The news went out to the world. Dean Martin, the king of cool, was dead. The entertainment world was shocked. Tributes poured in from across the globe. People who had loved his music, who had grown up watching his performances, who had been entertained by his charm and his voice, all took time to mourn him. But there was something hollow in the tributes. There was something incomplete about them, because everyone who truly knew him understood that Dean Martin had actually died 8 years earlier. On March 21, 1987, when his son's plane hit a mountain, the timing was almost too perfect to be coincidental. Dean Paul Martin Jr. died on March 21, 1987. Dean Martin Sr. died on December 25, 1995. That's exactly 8 years. 8 years to the day, almost, between the spiritual death and the physical death. 8 years of purgatory. 8 years of existing without truly living. 8 years of sitting in restaurants with an empty chair beside him, of ordering food for two, of pretending that his son was just in the bathroom and would return to the table any moment. On Thursday, December 28, 1995, late in the evening, the limos began arriving at Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park and Mortuary. The place was tucked away behind office towers along Wilshire Boulevard near Glendon Avenue. It had opened in 1904 and was the final resting place for Hollywood's most legendary figures. This was where they brought their dead to say goodbye. The mourners came under cover of darkness. Mortuary attendants escorted the celebrities through side entrances, away from the prying eyes of photographers and reporters. The paparazzi stood behind fences with stepladders, trying to identify the arriving guests. Jerry Lewis was there. When Lewis heard the news of Dean's death, he was reported to be completely shattered and grief-stricken. Despite their partnership ending 40 years earlier, despite the years of separation, the bond between them had never completely dissolved. They had been brothers in a way that transcended the normal understanding of the word. And now, one of those brothers was gone. Rosemary Clooney was there to sing. She stood in that chapel and performed Dean's signature song, "Everybody Loves Somebody," the same song he had been singing when he learned of his son's death 8 years earlier, the same song that had been his greatest hit, knocking the Beatles off the charts in 1964. The song now took on new meaning, a final tribute to a man whose love had sustained him through life and whose loss had ultimately destroyed him. Don Rickles was there. Bob Newhart was there. Charlie Sheen was spotted entering. Dorothy Hamill, Dean's ex-wife, was among the mourners. And Dina Martin was there to say goodbye to her father. To say goodbye to a man she had watched slowly fade away year after year, consumed by a grief that never loosened its grip. But one notable absence hung over the proceedings. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin's closest friend, his brother in every way except blood, did not attend the funeral in person. The reasons were complex. Sinatra himself was in poor health, struggling with his own medical issues. But there was something else. There was recognition that Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra existed in a realm that transcended normal ceremonies of death. They had been more than friends. They had been a force in American culture. And perhaps Sinatra understood that coming to that funeral, facing that reality, would be too much for him to bear. The service lasted until approximately 8 p.m. in the morning. The news was released. Dean Martin had been laid to rest in the Sanctuary of Peace, a small alcove about 50 yards away from where Marilyn Monroe was buried. His grave marker bore the inscription of his greatest hit, "Everybody Loves Somebody." Now, as we stand back and look at this entire tragedy, we must ask ourselves, what does this story really mean? What are we supposed to take from it?